The next crash that I'm going to discuss is an incident that took place in the Soviet Union, in the Karelian Associated Soviet Socialist Republic, in Lake Onega, near the town of Entino, the now abandoned village of Entino, which lies in the district that was downwind of the Chernobyl incident, the nuclear meltdown. But about 8 in the morning on April 27, 1961, 25 hunters and woodsmen were on the northern shoreline of the lake. It was 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. They weren't sure because time is often confused in the Soviet Union because of the divisions in the time zones, and so one man's watch may read 8 a.m. while another's may read 9 a.m. or 10 a.m. Anyways, these hunters and woodsmen out on an expedition saw a vehicle, oval-shaped, with a blue-green light about the size of a passenger plane, come at them from an east-to-west course. It was low to the ground, traveling at tremendous speed. The lake being frozen over in April still in the Soviet Union, apparently the object impacted the ground. It left 3 trenches, one large 27-meter-long trench and 2 smaller trenches, and it was making no noise except for the impact of the ground and the lake itself. Apparently it hit on the shoreline that bordered the lake and the ground, overturning huge chunks of ice from the lake. And the object, once it impacted, again headed off in its east to west course in a wobbling motion, but still continuing on its trajectory. Well, the forest ranger of the district was contacted, and a civilian military unit was dispatched to the area, including members of the USSR Armed Forces and some technical scientists and whatnot. And what they found was they checked the area where the object originally had impacted, and they found traces of radioactivity. But what was more peculiar was the fragments of metal found in the trenches upon the shoreline, and also the ice, the chunks of ice that were overturned, glowed a very strange green, and hence that is the UFO touch and go at Lake Onega. Now that preceded and was followed by, and sightings preceded that impact all across the Soviet Union that day of April 27, 1961, of some anomalous object traveling at a very high rate of speed. And apparently it lost altitude and went so low that it actually impacted Lake Onega in the Soviet Union. The next one I'd like to reference is from February 12, 1968, from the Schmidt and Randall book UFO Crash at Roswell. It's from Uruguay, Colombia. Now apparently 3 large explosions were heard by people after they saw this metallic-looking disc-shaped object fly overhead. Well, they followed it into the forest where they had seen debris falling and picked up a large chunk of metal, which they noticed could not be bent or burnt or cut. In fact, when they banged it on with a hammer, it gave off an orange or greenish hue, and it made some sort of peculiar sound once the hammer touched the surface. So it was carted off to Bogota, Colombia, and eventually the American air attaché got his hands on it, claiming it was from a satellite or from a vehicle from outer space, and later attributed that to an American satellite. One I'd like to reference is from July 15, 1974, again from the Randall Schmidt book. In Spain, on that day, the story goes that the Spanish military had recovered some sort of wreckage or disc and had carted it off to a military base for analysis. On April 18, 1962, a UFO apparently exploded over the desert of Las Vegas, Nevada. The story begins in Oneida, New York, where residents claim to have seen a large, glowing red object at a high altitude heading towards the west. This was confirmed by the North American Radar Defense Command, NORAD, in Colorado Springs, who picked up returns on their radars. So they track it throughout the Midwest. Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas is put on alert. Interceptors are scrambled from Phoenix. The object itself heads heading west, and it heads over Nephi, Utah, where residents claim to have heard the sound of jets rumbling in the atmosphere, which could explain the interceptors giving chase to the object. Apparently, in Utah, in Eureka, Utah, the object lands, disrupting electrical service as it lands near a power plant, disrupting electrical service in and around the Eureka area. Then it takes off again. And at that point, that's when the folks at Nellis Air Force Base and NORAD lose the return or the telltale blip on their radar screen when the object is 70 miles northwest of Las Vegas. Now, apparently, one witness came forward saying that he was driving south when he saw an orange object, dome-shaped, overhead, pass over his vehicle and land in the desert near a power plant. And he said a light was shining on the ground so bright it looked as though the sun were coming up, this being late at night, as it cast an orange glow on the ground. He said it landed and then took off, and it came from the east and headed west. And apparently in this man who refuses to identify himself looked for through newspapers, because he was on a business trip, to see if there was any mention, and the only mention came in the Las Vegas Sun. That said that there was a power disturbance and that there was an anomalous object seen in the area. Now, also, residents of Reno, Nevada reported that when this incident occurred, they heard a loud rumbling noise that could be heard for miles, and quote-unquote, the streets of Reno were lit up like the midday sun. Now, part of these reports come from Frank Edwards, who is known for his flying saucer stories in the 1950s. The problem about Frank Edwards was that he wrote mostly by memory and didn't corroborate his sources. Even further, a man came forward from Nellis Air Force Base stating that he had been, on that day, April 18, 1962, he had been aroused and awakened from his bed in the middle of the night with 30 other officers. They were driven to a quote-unquote debris field, forced to pick up each minute piece of the debris that was scattered about as they were on their hands and knees using a flashlight and a retrieval bag. And apparently, when this mission was completed, they were hustled back on to a bus, debriefed and sworn to secrecy. And he remembered peering out the window of the bus because the windows had been covered with cardboard, dark cardboard, so they could not look out. And he remembered that he had pulled a piece of the cardboard back when no one was listening, when no one was looking, and saw a discoidal craft, discoidal in nature, stuck or embedded into the ground. On May 21st, 1953, allegedly a disc came down 20 miles northwest of Kingman, Arizona. One of the informants claims that he was awakened in the middle of the night and taken to an Air Force base in Nevada, probably Nellis, and flown into Arizona, where he was put on a bus with covered windows and dark cardboard and escorted out to the crash site with 20 other people. And like the Las Vegas story that took place 10 years later, they're taken out to a debris field. At that point, they see a saucer embedded into the ground at about a 30-degree angle. It's 30 feet in diameter with no signs of structural damage. They're instructed not to say anything about it, obviously, about what they'd seen. And then they notice off to the side a tent. And inside that tent, there's a lot of people milling about. This informant goes on to say he saw a being about 4 feet tall with a large cranium, 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth, lying, obviously deceased, on a table. So after he is there to take pictures and to examine the soil content in and around the where the saucer had gone into the ground, they're put back on the bus with cardboard over the window so they can't see, and then they're hurried back to the air base and flown back to Nevada. The next story comes from Norway, Spitsbergen Island, off the coast of Norway, September 12, 1952. Story has it that some Norwegian troops in the remote snowy areas and vast expanses of Spitsbergen Island come across a disc embedded in the snow. They say that they find Russian logbooks, Russian writing on the aircraft, and that they figure out that the vehicle can fly 20,000 kilometers without refueling. So the Norwegian Army High Command, the Norwegian General Staff, 3 years on in 1955 prepare a publication whereby a high colonel says that he believed that this craft was not of terrestrial origin, that even though the British and American experts had been called in to view the wreckage, that it had been misidentified as Russian. On December 6th, 1950, this incident gets muddled somewhat. Apparently, an object came down somewhere west of Laredo, Texas, in the Del Rio, Texas vicinity, or in El Indio, Mexico, just over the United States-Mexican border. I think the way to pick up the story is a woman from Lorain, Ohio, convalescing in a dude ranch in Texas, said that one night while they were sitting out on the porch, she saw this bright flash of light. It wasn't a shooting star. It was very luminous. And they saw it go over the horizon. They saw a huge explosion. So the ranch boss decided to take a ride out there the next day. And the story goes on to say this woman who was writing to her husband in a letter to a man named Warren Smith at lunch. This man, just if I could back up a bit, this man would every day read letters from his wife who was away, convalescing. She was sick. And one day this letter came about whereby this odd object flew over. It wasn't an airliner. It wasn't a shooting star. And the ranch boss went over and checked it out the following day. And the woman goes on to write to her husband that apparently it was some sort of discoidal object, and that there were small beings in spacesuits recovered, and their bodies charred beyond recognition. So that's the place where we'll pick it up for Del Rio, Texas. Now, December 6th, 1950, Dyess Air Force Base, Texas, a group testing out what was the F-94 Interceptor, one of the primordial jets that the United States Air Force was developing. They're testing it out and making test runs, and all of a sudden NORAD, North American Radar Defense Command, Air Defense Command, picks up a return on the radar. And sure enough, all of the folks at the base are watching this object as it paces the airport itself and then hovers over the field. And the pilots are waiting for orders to scramble their jets to go and intercept it. Those orders never come. NORAD gets returns on their radar, and apparently the object heads off to the south, and they see some sort of explosion. So this, who's relating the story, this pilot from Dyess Air Force Base, jumps in a light single-engine plane, prop-driven, with his buddy as co-pilot. They land, they see a hullabaloo going on, and they land about 300 to 500 yards away from the site. And apparently, as they get out of their aircraft, they're stopped abruptly by the military police and told to get out of here. We don't care what branch of the service you're from. Get in your aircraft, get out. So as they turn around, they notice there's fragments of metal on the ground, as if there was some sort of explosion or some sort of deterioration. They pick up some of the metal, put it in their pocket without anybody seeing, and head in their plane and split. During that time, they noticed two large sandy mounds where it seemed that the object had come to rest and plowed up these two sandy mounds. Anyways, so they have the piece of metal, and then when they go back, they try to do metallurgic tests on it. Notice that they can't heat it or bend it. They notice it's honeycombed in structure under a microscope, and they had never seen this alloy before. And being well-versed in metallurgy, they didn't know what to think of this particular element. So the pilot, with his little fragment of metal, takes it off to a marine buddy of his at a metallurgy lab in Hagerstown, Maryland. and it's studied there. And he's hastily called in under armed guard, saying, "Where'd you get this metal?" He's debriefed, this and that, and he said, "Well, I flew down to a site on the Texas-Mexican border. It was crawling with Mexican and American officials, and they were arguing over jurisdiction of the property. Eventually, the Americans won out and carted the wreckage off, complete with charred flight crew, to a base in Texas." So he has reprimanded the pilot who originally picked up the fragment and sworn to secrecy, in fact, told to sign an oath. So, and then the story continues that even President Eisenhower was briefed on this incident. September 12th or September 15th, 1957, Ubatuba, Brazil. A journalist in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, receives a strange letter from some fishermen who claim that while on a beach at Ubatuba, Brazil, fishing, they noticed an object that came right at them, turned sharply, and then climbed to an altitude just above them, and then exploded over them, showering fragments down. Well, what the fishermen did is they sent it off to an Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, or APRO, member, Dr. Fonts, who took the fragments of metal that they collected and sent them under scrutiny and analysis. They were found to contain absolutely pure magnesium, or at that time a purity of magnesium that had never been obtained, 99.99%. And under more analysis, it showed that the metal sample had not been burned, but it had been broken apart by some sort of explosion. So Dr. Fonts then forwards some of the pieces to the United States Air Force for analysis, never gets calls back. Meanwhile, tries to contact the witnesses and is unsuccessful. And the story goes that perhaps Brazilian officials had gotten to these fishermen, telling them to keep their mouths shut if they want to keep their traps open. So it was a very bizarre case because it was the purest concentration of magnesium that had ever been found on this planet. So that had physical evidence for it. July 31st, 1947, Maury Island, which is near Tacoma, Washington. Two intelligence officers at Hamilton Air Force Base in California get a call saying that two harbor patrolmen of Maury Island have pieces of a UFO. So they're quickly dispatched to the area, and they speak to the two harbor patrolmen who are out in the boat with one with their son and their dog on an overcast gray day, when 6 donut-shaped objects appeared to the right and behind them. They were donut-shaped, 100 feet in diameter, with a 20-foot, it looked like, open circle in the middle of them. Well, the 6 objects, it seemed that one object had trouble maneuvering, and one of the objects came to that object's assistance as it wobbled in the air. Suddenly there was a dull thud, and there was a shower of fragments, or slag as they called it, that showered all about them on the ocean and on the deck of their boat. And as these pieces, these fragments that seemed to be spitting and shearing off metal, fell onto the deck of the boat, it killed the dog instantly and burned the boy's arm badly. Well, obviously the two harbor patrolmen, shaken visibly, take pieces of this extraterrestrial craft and call it their higher-ups, who in turn contact the Air Force, and eventually gets back to the intelligence unit, the closest intelligence unit at the time at Hamilton Air Force Base. And they analyze the material. The two intelligence officers go on to say that they think that this is a legitimate UFO crash, and in fact they go to the press. Now, oddly enough, one of the harbor patrolmen gets a peculiar visitation. They hadn't spoken to any press. They had just spoken to their chief when a strange, oddly dressed man shows up at their door in a dark suit, very peculiar looks, a classical MIB visitation, a Men in Black visitation, whereby this person or humanoid visits the officers prior to their release of any information whatsoever. and this is a classic tale of men in black that prevailed in the 1950s, whereby someone would have a UFO encounter, and before they have a chance to tell anyone, here it is, a man showing up at their door, threatening them with their life if they were to tell anything about that. So the two harbor patrolmen are sworn to secrecy. They have the encounter with the men in black, and the two intelligence officers are reprimanded, and they're called down to Texas to their higher-ups base. Plane never makes it. Plane crashes. Sabotage? Not sure. Well, this story reeks of being a hoax because the two harbor patrolmen were never found, and when Kenneth Arnold somehow was implicated in this as being the person who originally forwarded the information, but I think that was a black mark against Kenneth Arnold, who was the first to coin the term flying saucer because of his encounter in late June of 1947. So this one reeks of a hoax, as does March 25th, 1948, Aztec, New Mexico. Frank Scully reported, and Frank Scully, with his book Behind the Flying Saucers, put out in the 1950s, tended to elaborate stories without substantiating them with facts. But he goes on to say that Dr. G, who was later confirmed to be Leo Gebauer, who backs off of the story, and a Silas Newton, a physicist, apparently relay a story of a crash that happened near Aztec, New Mexico, whereby a 100-foot in diameter craft, 30 feet high, plummets into the desert near Aztec, New Mexico. The military surround it and wait 2 days before moving in. When they do move in, they peer in through a broken porthole and see that some of the aliens have been suffocated. They put in a pole, as the story goes, to unleash a hatch. A hatch opens up. They end up carting out 16 dead alien bodies. They line them up on the ground. They're in indestructible suits. They're anywhere from 35 to 42 inches in height. Perfect teeth, more human-looking, although their heads are very large. The military moves in and carts them off. Their skin is brown in color because it looked as though they were burned or charred. And then Scully goes on to reference another crash outside of Phoenix, Arizona, where another 16 bodies were pulled out, alien bodies out of a crash. And then he references one in Paradise Valley, Arizona, whereby a craft 30 feet in diameter impacts the earth and just a single occupant is removed, a single pilot is removed. He also looks to be humanoid with perfect teeth. And finally, there is a story that Scully reiterates of a crash or of a discoidal impact that takes place near the White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico, where all sorts of anomalous aerial phenomena has been documented over the past 50 years.